So, I said I'd get out this week, but I finished watching... I finished watching the original Gundam, 0079. The, I believe, 1979 TV anime. It was good. Out of every Gundam I've watched, probably the one that I'm the least invested in. Comparatively to, say, Seed, IBO, and 00. At least as of right now. I know there's a hell of a lot more to UC that I need to get through, but we're talking about just 0079 in a vacuum here because, well, and we will be making reference to the Origin, although I do think the Origin retcons some stuff from the original series, or is set kind of outside slightly of the original UC, but we're only making reference to the Origin here and some aspects of it in tandem with 0079, but mainly 0079 in a vacuum because I've not seen anything past it yet, so I don't know how it and its events are going to influence stuff going forward. Obviously, I'll find out because that's the plan, but yeah. But before we get into it, if you're new, the sub button, be really appreciated. Like, comment, notification bell, YouTube stuff. Anyway, so, like I said, I think it's good. I don't think it's bad. Its age definitely shows. It's a very, very old show. The show's more than double my age, right? I can't really fault it for being old. Although one thing I will say, and I think I said this in my last brief Gundam discussion video, that intro song, oh god, that's hard to listen to. That is so hard to listen to. It's got all of the cheese you'd expect from like a, well, 80s anime intro. It is, oh boy, it is something. But yeah, that's probably the hardest part of the show to watch, is that intro, which is why I skipped it everything after like episode 3. But yeah, let's talk about the characters first of all. Let's start with Amuro, the main character. I don't really feel anything in particular toward him. From the Origin, I didn't like him at all, really. I thought he was a fucking whiny bitch. And at the start of 0079, he definitely is a whiny bitch. But he stops being as much of a whiny bitch as time goes on. He grows, he matures a bit, and it turns out he's a fucking new type. It's not really explained what new types are, or how they come about. They just kind of do. And we'll touch on that later in this video, probably, unless I forget. It has taken me like 3 weeks to watch the show, so if there are details I forget, bear that in mind. I'm busy with other stuff. I have uni, okay? But, yeah, Amuro, out of all the main characters of the Gundam shows so far, he's my least favorite. I honestly prefer Setsuna to Amuro, and Setsuna's like a brick wall for most of 00. So, I don't dislike Amuro, don't get me wrong. Especially toward the end of the series when he's not as annoying. But I feel like he just doesn't have too much personality, and it feels like a lot of his development happens really quickly. And that's arguably, I'd say, my main gripe with 0079. I don't know why I'm calling it 0079, just call it 79. Or whatever. Is the pacing sometimes feels way too fast. It doesn't feel like there's enough time spent on certain aspects of the story, and certain character moments and character developments and character relationships primarily, I think, is the biggest thing that is not focused on or is skipped out on too much, is it feels like certain developments happen way too fast. Like, Amuro's character changes. I mean, it's... Amuro, there are notable points for which both Amuro and the whole crew of the White Base start to develop a lot more as soldiers and as people, from just being, civilians or inexperienced as they are at the start. For example, Ryu's death is a very big catalyst for developing the crew and making them go, look, we really need to get our shit together. We need to get our act together. We need to stop acting the way we are. Ryu sacrificed himself. He's a, him being gone is a big thing, right? And we need to move with it. We need to accept it and move on and adapt to it and become better people because of it, right? And they do, and that's a very good catalyst. And again, later on, Matilda's death is another catalyst for Amuro as well, to make him strive to become better. But it feels like some things just happen really fast. Like, why does Amuro... I know that new type shenanigans, right? But that's not a good enough reason, because we don't really understand why Amuro cares so much that Lala's fighting or that Lala dies. I know that she's, as far as he's aware, a civilian, right? And, she dies protecting Shah to his hand. And he's like, oh, Shah, it's your fault that Lala was fighting. Well, Lala chose to fight in the end of the... Right? She chose to protect Shah. She chose to fight for Shah, right? She does choose this. Yes, Shah probably does groom her into it a little bit, as we see in the origin, him saving her and stuff and putting her into the Flanagan Institute, but which we don't really know a whole lot about. You know, we just know it's a thing to do with new types that shows up. But like, I don't really see why. And obviously, you know, a civilian being dragged into the fighting is something Amuro can very much relate with. But he doesn't really interact with Lala enough for me to see why he'd care so much. And it's the same thing with Kai as well, with Miharu. Kai and Miharu do interact, but they don't really interact a whole lot. And yeah, you can see there's clearly some aspects that Kai relates to with Miharu, like for example, what she's doing for her, you know, siblings. But I don't see why he'd care as much as he does, why her death gets to him as much as it does, because I don't think there's enough time spent establishing their relationship and, you know, giving them enough time to interact with each other properly to give a good enough reason for the viewer that Kai should care as much as he does, you know, why Amuro should care as much as he does. That's one thing. And again, same thing with Slegga when he's introduced. What goes on with him and Mirai just seems to happen almost out of nowhere. Yes, you've got I'd say a scene, really, maybe 2 scenes from Slegga's entire screen time that can equate to what happened, you know, his and Mirai's relationship developing the way it does, but like, even then it's barely. I feel like the character relationships is the biggest thing that needed more focus in this show. And obviously, you know, I get it, budget things, there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of ideas in the original Gundam, like a lot of ideas. Lots of stuff is going on, and I feel like they didn't quite have enough budget or time to cover everything they wanted in as much detail as they wanted. And I mean, you know, that's fair enough, it's an old show. It's also a long show, it's 42 episodes, I think. So, you know, they had a lot of, they did have a lot of time, and I feel like, you know, they could have focused more on it, because I feel like there were some things that were a bit too slow, if anything. Like, the early parts of the show, yes, a lot happens, but I feel like that could have been sped up a bit, and more time in the middle and toward the end could have been slowed down a little bit. For example, the attack on Solomon is 2 episodes. The attack on Aobaoku is 2 episodes. These big battles that are like, but you know, these big set piece battles that end the war are 4 episodes in total. Like, there's barely anything. Barely any time seems to be dedicated to these really big impactful events that happen toward the end compared to stuff that happens earlier on. Like, you know, when they're on Earth, you know, trying to leave Zeon territory, you know, leading into Gamma's death, and then meeting up with the Federation, right? All of that seems to have way more focus put on it than the bigger... I mean, obviously Gamma's death is big, because it, you know, kind of... You get to see some of Shah's motivation, but also... Shah, I feel like, is done a bit dirty in the original series. Just from the original series, I don't see why people like Shah as much as they do. From the origin, I can get it, but from 0079, Shah is kind of all over the place, if I'm being honest. He's not as grounded or solidified as a character as he is in the origin. I assume that his character, because I don't believe he's dead. There's no way Shah's gone, because you don't see him die. He kills Kashylia right at the end of the series, and then you don't see him again after that. You know, takes off his mask, says, you know, blah, 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 and he gets back to his original goal of wiping out the Zabi family, which he said wasn't his real goal for a little bit. You know, something new types. Again, I feel like more explanation on new types, what they are, why they're so important. Yes, you know, they're great soldiers and they're really good at fighting. They're a future of humanity. But I feel like more focus, a bit more detail need to be fleshed out on new types in this to make certain actions make sense. I assume later on in the series this will be done. And so these things will make more sense as I watch more. But right now, it feels like there's not enough information. It feels like some things are lacking. If you ask me, like I feel like there's just not enough there to justify a whole lot of things that happen. Or at least, for example, mainly Shah's motivations and how they flip-flop a little bit. You know, he lets Gamma die because he wants to get revenge on the Zawi family, but then he doesn't want to get revenge on the Zawi family. But then he does at the end. You know, it feels a bit disjointed sometimes. I feel like maybe if there was more time spent, again, on character motivations, character development, I feel like maybe this would have been smoothed over and it would have made a bit more sense. But, you know, also how Amuro... I assume Amuro was a new type from the beginning, but he hadn't awakened to it, and then when he met Lala, he does. Because one thing I will say is, the stuff that happens after Side 6 is really cool, right? But I feel like it's not explained enough. There's not enough information, not enough detail put on the stuff that happens after the Side 6 event, where Amuro meets Lala, and also Amuro's dad just becoming a bumbling fool, like out of nowhere, and Amuro's like, oh, it's signs of oxygen deficiency. But I thought the sides were supposed to be like, you know, habitable. Surely there would be enough oxygen. Like, how is his dad suffering from oxygen deficiency? Don't know. Also, what? He's become a complete bumbling fool. This man was supposed to have invented the Gundam, right? Like, and now he's just a rambling lunatic. Like, what? I feel like that he was shafted. Maybe there's something I'm missing there that someone can explain to me in the comments, but I feel like that was awfully done. What I do like, though, is that we get to see that the Gundam is actually what holds Amuro back, and they have to upgrade it with the magnetic, whatever the fuck, the electromagnetic doohickey that magically gets rid of the fucking physical friction between the parts. It's like, what? I don't... Okay, yeah, sure. So that the Gundam can keep up with Amuro's reaction speed now that he's a new type. I do like that. I actually think that's really cool that they have to do that. But, at the beginning, we see Amuro being, like, overly reliant on the Gundam, which makes fucking sense. He literally has only piloted something other than a car once before this, and that was the Gundam. It makes sense he's relying on the Gundam's power. He's not a soldier, he's just a child, right? We'll touch on that. This might be a much longer video than I was expecting it to be. Right? And then at the end, it's actually Amuro. The Gundam isn't strong enough to keep up with Amuro compared to at the beginning, where the Gundam is far more powerful than Amuro could ever hope to be at the beginning, right? It's a good dynamic. It's a good bookend, I guess you could say. They're good bookends. At the beginning, Amuro is insignificant compared to the Gundam, and at the end, the Gundam needs to be upgraded to meet Amuro's capabilities, right? Good bookending for Amuro's development as a soldier, at least. And arguably as a character. He's a much better character at the end of this show as he is at the beginning. That's what we call character development. I do think Amuro does have character development. I feel like maybe it could have been fleshed out a bit more, and other characters especially. Amuro, I think, does get the best treatment out of the cast. Although, at least from I've literally just finished watching the last episode, so if I feel like I'm all over the place, that's exactly why. And also, I'm trying to think back on things from like a couple of weeks ago, from when I watched the early couple of episodes. It's been a long time for me to watch the whole of the show. Bear that in mind. But yeah. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. Let's actually talk about the whole crew. In fact, let's juggle about more characters. I have briefly touched on some of them and their relationships here and there, but and Shah and Amuro mainly, specifically Amuro. But let's talk about the crew at the beginning. Bright is a terrible leader at the beginning of the show. He has no idea what he's doing. He is way out of his depth, being the commanding officer of a ship, and it shows because he does not know how to handle Amuro and his insubordinates really early on. But he also doesn't know how to handle Amuro not being a trained soldier either, because you'll see. This is literally like episode 2. The second time Amuro pilots the Gundam. Bright, this stuck in my head because it kind of annoyed me a little bit. It struck a chord as it really highlights how Bright is not up to the task at the start of the show. So Amuro's piloting the Gundam, and he comes up with this tactics, get behind, so the sun's behind them, so they're not shooting into the sun, the enemy are, and And Ryu is also with him in the core fire. And Ryu forgets to put his comms on. That seems like a pretty fucking big fumble for someone that is a soldier and is trained, at least much more than a regular fucking civilian. Right? That seems like a big blunder. That seems like a huge failure from a procedural side of things that a soldier should not be making, right? Yeah, they've not been in combat, but, still, you shouldn't be making a mistake like that. And yet, Bright's like, don't do that, don't let it happen again. But Amuro coming up with these tactics, being like, no, that's not what you should be doing. You should not be doing that. Don't do that. No. You're relying on the Gundam's power too much. Even though Amuro's literally a 16-year-old kid who's never fucking engaged with military activity properly, ever. It's like, why is Amuro being held to a higher standard than an actual soldier here? I don't get this. And I assume it's to show that Bright is just out of his depth, but it really annoyed me the way that the characters were treated completely unevenly given their difference in status. Ryu is a soldier and Amuro is a 16-year-old kid who has piloted this thing twice. He only knows how to pilot it because he read the fucking instruction manual, right? You see what I'm saying? And also all of the crew of the White Base are out of their depth. Sayla is like a medic kind of, and then she ends up having to be an operator, and then eventually she ends up piloting the G-Fighter, G-Fighter, G-Armor, G-Ball, etc., etc., etc. Right? She actually has a pretty good development. Actually, Sayla I feel like doesn't develop a whole lot. Zayla, Artesia could maybe have gotten a bit more development, if you ask me. You know, she's obviously out of her depth for the role she's put into, but she does end up, you know, doing medical stuff. Fraubo as well, going from just looking after the kids to replacing Zayla in the operator position. Mirai, who also turns out to be a new type by the end, so does Zayla. It seems like most of the white base crew are new types. In fact, even the little kids are. I wonder if there's some meaning behind that why they develop as new types, I don't know. Again, I've said this before. I feel like they need to be more fleshing out on new types, if you ask me, but I've already said that. Right, Mirai, she kind of knows how to pilot a ship. Kind of. And, you know, but she ends up doing a pretty fucking good job overall, I'd say. She doesn't seem too out of her depth. At least the story doesn't present her as being. She says she is, but it never really shows, if you ask. I mean, you know, obviously little random tidbits of, like, piloting, I'm obviously not going to remember. But it doesn't seem like she's ever actually out of her depth other than she says she is, you know what I'm saying? Ryu, as well, he's obviously out of his depth. He's never actually engaged in combat, you know, proper combat experience. He's done training and stuff, but he's never actually been involved. So his mistake of not having comms on at the beginning, you know, is understandable, but it's Bright's reaction to him and Amuro that I dislike. But again, I don't think you're meant to like Bright at the beginning. He's meant to be a dick. I don't think you're meant to like Amuro at the beginning either, to be honest. Yeah, Bright develops quite a bit. He comes into his own, especially after Ryu's death, and he ends up, you know, in a slump. He ends up, you know, completely broken. He ends up overworking himself and collapsing and being ill because of, you know, all the stress that he's dealing with. And I get it. Bright is probably him and Amuro are probably the most out of their depth. Amuro is a 16-year-old kid who has never piloted anything ever, and Bright has been thrust into a leadership position when he was probably never going to reach this, you know, within the natural span of the war, right? That was probably never going to happen to Bright if what happens at the beginning happened. Bright was never going to end up as a leader, and he just had to deal with it. He had to take the leadership position, and it shows he does not know what he's doing, hence why he hits Amuro many times. And then you have other characters, like you have Kai, who I think is probably my favorite character, at least up until about, well, the Miharu stuff. I feel like that doesn't do anything really good for Kai's character because there's not enough focus on it, enough development for them as to why Kai would care, as I said earlier. I'm not going to keep hammering that point. But Kai I actually really like in the beginning. He's a regular-ass guy and acknowledges that he's a regular-ass guy and acknowledges that this whole crew are regular-ass people. He's like... And he never actually says anything that's wrong or even snarky or out of pocket. Everything he says is like a genuine, yeah, just keep that in mind. Like, you know, there's a scene when they're on Earth and Amuro is about to go out in the the core fighter for the Gundam. And Kai says, don't get yourself shot down. And then Amuro gets pissed off. It's like, at the end of the day, what Kai's saying isn't wrong. You're still inexperienced, Amuro. Right? Like, Kai is not wrong here. And, you know, Kai's told, oh, sort out your attitude. And he does need to, because it's not suited for the situation they're in. But he's never wrong. And his snide, snarky personality that he has early on, I actually quite like. Even though, you know, he does kind of get shafted. But then he does actually, you know, come into his own. He is a coward. But then he starts, you know, going out of comfort zone. He gets, you know, he starts piloting the gun cannon, for fuck's sake, you know? He does grow out of being a coward. And even shows that he almost ends up a bit egotistical at the end. Because when they're attacking Ao Baoku, he lands, you know, starts blasting open the door, and then when some of the GMs flying ahead of him goes, but I was the first one to land, and then they all get wiped out, and then his next line kind of makes him seem less egotistical, but the line of him saying, I was the first one to land, makes it sound like he's, you know, kind of almost full of himself, like he's like, yeah, I'm kind of good, and to be fair, he's lived this long, right, you know? And then you also have Hayato, he's there to pilot the gun tank, and that's basically all he's there for. He doesn't really do anything else, I feel, and he doesn't really develop. I'd say barely fucking speaks. He's just kind of there, right? Anything else I really want to say about the cast? I don't think so. Yeah, I don't really think so. I was surprised by some of the characters that they killed off in such, well, what's the fucking word? Anticlimactically. Some characters just kind of die. I feel like that might be a case of, you know, it's old and so presenting things the way they want to as being, you know, dramatic as they are. Or maybe that's the point, you know, it's a war. People's deaths aren't these big dramatic events. They are anticlimactic. People die all the time in war. So maybe that's the point. But, you know, some of the characters, especially from seeing the origin, some of the characters that are really important in the origin, just getting killed off like they're nothing is really interesting. And I think the perspective I have coming from the origin actually changes that. And it's probably why I think Shah is a bit of a letdown in 0079, because he's so cool in the origin, because he's the focus of the origin, he's the main character of the origin, and here he's a main / side villain depending on the arc that's currently going on. Like, he spends a lot of the show, he spends quite a bit of time not actually in the show after they get to Earth, you know what I'm saying? Also, one thing I want to say as well, the Xeon, their suit names are so goofy. All of the Xeon suits look so fucking goofy. Like, the mobile armors look goofy. Their naming schemes are goofy. But, like, how threatening Xeon is supposed to be, you know, they're literally space Nazis. Why the fuck are they so goofy with their naming schemes? I'm also obsessed with the letter G. Like, the Zaku and, there's probably one other one. Are, like, the only suit without the letter G in them. Like, what's their obsession with the letter fucking G? Yeah, I found that kind of funny. That's a genuine thought I had while I was watching the show. I was like, why they all got the, why they all like, it's like the Gelgoog. Fucking, what is that? And the Zeong. The mobile armor that, Shah pilots at the end. Like, what? Yeah, so we want to call it after the nation. But put a G at the end, so it's not just the Xeon. It's really goofy. But to be fair, you know, there are, because you take, Giran? Oh, I can't remember his name. You know, the dickhead of the Zabi kids. He is, you know, comically villainous. Compared to, like, Dozel, who's a relatively nice guy. Gamma, who's just inexperienced and a kid. And, Cassilia, who's probably the most... I don't really know what to say. Normal? Maybe not normal, but... grounded, probably, is the best thing to say of the lot. You know, they have an interesting dynamic as a family, but again, I think there's not enough spent on them. But you can see that, you know, Degwim, the leader of the Zabi family in Xeon, is not a complete evil scumbag. He wants to go for peace talks. He wants to, you know, have a funeral for Gamma, but not make it a big political thing, you know? He wants to value his family, not just the push, the Xeon. It's interesting. I'll give it that. But yeah, if there's anything in particular I haven't mentioned in this video that you want to hear my thoughts on, let me know in the comments, and I will endeavor to respond. And yeah, I think that's where we'll leave that. I will double check what I'm moving on to after this, and I'll see you when I finish it. Unless you want to watch some of my other content, which I highly recommend you do, because I'm really like, I'm kind of like based and cool, you know? Anyway, with that out of the way, I've been an Aussie, you've been you, and I'll see you next time for another video. Ta-ta, for now.